Okay, so the last language learning strategy that we need to talk about is what's called cognitive, so using the mind. And one thing I think makes it really clear is to think about, what does someone do when they're reading a textbook? So if the person is kind of marking up the text with a highlighter, that's a cognitive strategy. If they're writing notes in the margin, that's another. If they're circling things, underlining things, if they, at the beginning of every page, they're asking themselves, what am I going to learn on this page? They make a prediction, they read the page, and then they see if the prediction was right. Those are all examples of cognitive strategies. So it's setting your mind to work on a little task to try to understand or carry out language. So those are examples of a cognitive strategy. So up until this point, what I've been talking about are all the things that we think of as inside a language learner that makes one language learner a little bit different than another. And just as we look over that whole list, just as I said at the beginning, second language research and also my own experience, I would say that aptitude and age are the least important. And things that are incredibly important are, what are those strategies that students use, motivation and attitudes, and previous educational background. One thing that over our time together you will probably see if you experience working with refugee or immigrant students at the Monroe Center in Spokane, one thing that you will probably see is how hard students have to work when they haven't had a really strong formal education in their first language. So for those students who didn't have access to learning to read and write in their first language, they actually have the hardest pathway to learning English that I've ever seen. So let's switch over. Let's switch to talking about the external factors. And we're really talking here about two different categories: what happens in the classroom, and then something called social distance. So at the top of your graphic organizer, I have the word social distance, and essentially what this refers to is a fellow named Schumann, John Schumann. He believed that when we look at students who succeed and students who don't succeed, and he used the word fossilize, so in other words, someone stops changing in their language development and they just stay in the same place, so much so that it becomes like a hardened shell. That's where their English or their French or their Spanish is. He used the term fossilization with that. So when he was looking at why does one student progress and another student fossilizes, he came to believe that essentially it comes down to how big of distance a language learner feels from the target language group, or how close that distance is. And so of course what he said was that greater the distance, the more difficult it will be for the language learner to be successful. And the closer that distance, the more likely they will be to be successful. And then he came up with these different factors that explain, that give us a way to think about how big is that distance or how close is that distance. So the one that I have at the top, social dominance, I actually think of as probably one of the most important. And this is, when you think about, we'll call it the language learning group and the target language group. So for example, if we have a group of students who move to the Spokane area from Ukraine, they would be the language learning group, and all of the English speakers in Spokane, they would be the target language group. So again, we've got language learning group, target language group. Whenever there is a difference in power between the two, whenever the target language group has a lot of power, a lot more power than the language learning group, or when the language learning group has a lot more power than the target language group, that creates more distance, and you're less likely to see really successful language learning occur. So for example, let's go back to the Ukraine example I brought in. So, for example, if Ukraine is thought of as not very important, the culture is not kind of deemed very important, the language isn't deemed very important by the target language group, then the more that the target language group thinks that English is more important than Ukraine, the bigger that distance, and vice versa. So when I go to Nicaragua, I experience a lot of English language learners who have moved to Nicaragua to retire because you can live there very cheaply. It's a very nice climate. As we get colder, as we get old, it's a very nice climate. And you can, for example, hire a full-time nurse to work, and a full-time housekeeper to work in your house. It's very affordable. So what you have is you have a language learner group, English speakers, in Nicaragua, in which there are Spanish speakers. Now, an interesting thing happens. The English speakers have far more resources. They have lots of money. They're from North America, which is considered far more important than Nicaraguan culture, and they see it that way. And so they have lots more power than the Spanish-speaking Nicaraguans. So that creates more distance. So it goes both ways. But the more that one group sees themselves as far more important than the other, then the less likely there is to be successful language learning. So that's a really good example of something that you will be able to control very little of for your students, but you have to be aware when they go out into the environment, when they go outside of your classroom, they're experiencing factors that make a big difference in their language learning, even though you don't personally get to control those. Okay, so what's another aspect of social distance? Attitude, and this is tied very closely with social dominance, and in fact that's why I put the two together. So attitude goes back to what is the attitude of the language learning group to the target language group, and vice versa. And I think you can already see with my example with Nicaragua that attitude and social dominance are very tied together. But one thing you might encounter is situations where there have been historical issues, political issues in the past that cause very negative attitudes. And so at that point you might see that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference in social dominance in terms of power, but when you think about that the language learning group has such negative feelings about the target language group, maybe because of something that happened in the past, then you see that distance widen. Or, for example, you might have the target language group having very negative opinions of the language learning group. For example, in the US, in a lot of places, people have English speakers have very negative stereotypes in their mind of people from Mexico, Spanish speakers. And so with that negative attitude that the target language group has versus the language learning group, that widens that distance. And so you're less likely to have successful language learning. Integration patterns, cohesiveness, and enclosure all really tightly fit together. And if you get a little confused, they seem to overlap each other. You're right, they do. But I'll try to pull them apart so that you can make sense of them. All three of these refer to how much interaction is there between the language learning group and the target language group. So for integration pattern, how likely are people to overlap with each other in the community? So for example, are all students expected to attend school together, whether they're native English speakers or they're language learners? Another aspect of integration pattern, does the community have a habit of welcoming newcomers? Do they already have kind of an informal potluck system set up for incoming refugees? Is there a community group that actually goes to the airport and greets refugees, whether they're connected with the organization that has the contract to greet them or not? So are there already some places in the community where people are going to cross paths because it's just assumed that we will all be in this together? So another example might be, does the community have a really wonderful summer sports program for children, including soccer? And does the English-speaking community have a habit of reaching out to immigrant and refugee families and making sure that they're aware of the sports program and making sure that they can participate, so that people are just meeting each other in this kind of integrated way? Very related to that is cohesiveness. How likely is the language learning group to kind of just stick to their own group? And how likely is the target language group just to stick to their own group? And so we're looking at how closely do people cling to each other and exclude others, both ways. So if the target language group tends to exclude others, no one else, I mean, if you weren't here 100 years ago, we're not interested in meeting you now in our community, then that's an example of a lot of social distance created by cohesiveness. And the same is true for the language learning group. If it's a group that really, maybe for religious reasons, tends to stay together to make sure that children are only meeting others from the community to ensure that they only marry, for example, within the community, then you're going to have a lot of cohesiveness. And you are not going to see that there being a lot of connection between the two groups. And so you're going to see more social distance. Related as well is enclosure. And enclosure is when, for example, a language learning group has their own bakery, they have their own grocery, they have their own churches, they have their own social clubs for young people. So whenever you see lots of different organizations within the community that are specifically meet the needs of that community, you're going to see more enclosure. Now, it might be tempting to think that having a Russian bakery, having a Korean grocery, that kind of thing, that's a bad idea then, because people are less likely to cross paths. But what we know is that people need to continue on in their own community, they need to continue on in their own culture, and those kinds of things support that. And so we might be tempted, kind of, here we are in week 1 of this course, we might be tempted to think that having bakeries and churches and grocery stores and social clubs for your own community is a bad idea because it creates more enclosure. But actually those things, they pay off in the end. But if there's no crossover at all because no one ever meets in a grocery store, no one ever cross paths at church between the two groups, then that's a negative thing. But I just want to make sure you understand that having your own kind of organizations within your communities, there's a lot of payoff in that too. Okay. Also, we have size, the size of the learner group. So when the language learning group is huge, there might actually be less need, less motivation for them to learn English. And so they might not need to. They might be able to, if people before them have arrived and set up businesses, they might actually be able to carry out their work in that language rather than having to learn English to do it. They might be able to find easily childcare providers for their children who speak that first language, and they don't have to do that in English. And if there's already a church set up that has services in their first language, again, they don't really need to do that. all of those things happen when the group size gets bigger. When the group size is really small, there's more need for the language learners to be learning English a little bit faster so they can find that daycare provider, so they can find a job and keep a job, and so that they can understand what's happening in church. So, so size really makes a difference, and one thing that you, for example, if you're taking the ESLG 489 Cultural and Linguistic Diversity in the Classroom, size actually comes up in some interviews that you'll hear with Ukraine, because I interview two people, Stan and Yelena, and Stan arrived in Moses Lake when there were very few Russian or Ukrainian speakers, and Yelena arrived 10 years later when there were many. And so you'll hear a little bit about how that impacted their experiences. So it's not that we want to avoid large groups of language learners to reduce that social distance, but rather it's more for you to keep in mind that it might explain why a student who there's only 10 other people in Spokane who speak this language is learning a little more quickly than someone who there's already a huge 20,000 strong population here from that language learner group. And finally, we need to look at cultural congruence and intended length of stay. So cultural congruence is how much does the first culture, C1, match up with that second culture? So how much does the culture that the language learner comes with, how well does it match up or not match up with the culture of Spokane, the mainstream English-speaking culture of Spokane? The more that they match up, the less the social distance. The more that they don't match up, the bigger that social distance. So again, that's nothing that you can impact as a teacher. It is nothing that the language learner themselves can impact. For example, a refugee student is simply placed in the place that they're sent through the refugee contract. And whether the culture is very similar or it's very different, really makes a difference. So again, the bigger the difference between the two cultures, the more distance the student is going to experience, the more social distance. Intended length of stay. For someone who intends to stay a long time, they will probably feel less social distance. They will feel like, this is my home. These are the people in my community. I need to get to know them. I'm invested in them. I'm in it for the long haul. And so if someone intends to stay a long time, maybe for the rest of their lives, then they will feel less social distance than someone who maybe they will stay for the rest of their life, but what they really want is they want to return to their country as soon as possible. So sometimes you might have two people who both arrived as refugees, and you're seeing a big difference in their language learning. And if you spend time with them, you might find that one of them has accepted that this is it. This is where I'm going to live for the rest of my life. And so they're learning English a little more quickly. And the other, they're just waiting for the war to stop. They are just waiting for it to be safe enough that they and their children can return. And so in their mind, this is only a temporary thing, and they're maybe not so invested in learning English. And so intended length of stay can really make a difference, and that's something that usually you can only find out by talking with the student or with their family members. Now I'm going to kind of change gears a little bit. We're still talking about external factors, but what I'm talking about is what happens in the classroom. And I have these written out in two different ways: curriculum and pedagogy, and instruction. Curriculum and pedagogy, curriculum refers to what is being taught and how closely connected is it with what the student is motivated to learn, what the student has already learned, so building a bridge between that, and also how it matches up with their cultural assumptions, with what they, the ways that they have kind of come to think about history or think about other things. And so curriculum has to do with what's being taught, what's the order that it's being taught. And it can really create a big language learning issue for students if it doesn't match up with what the student expects. So for example, if the curriculum in your program is entirely focused on listening and speaking, but a student came to you only studying English through reading and writing, a bridge needs to be built. That doesn't mean that you need to or even will have the right to change the curriculum, but rather that you need to build that bridge for their students so they can go from the way they used to learn to the way that they now, if they're going to stay in this program, need to learn. Pedagogy refers to how someone learns, what gets them to that learning. So probably what you might think of are methods and strategies. And pedagogy, a word on pedagogy, because it's a word that we'll use many times throughout this program and especially in this course, pedagogy comes from the word that was used for a slave in Greek times whose entire role was to carry the children to school and to pick them up and carry them back. And that meant literally for the very young children to actually carry them so that they didn't have to walk that long distance. So when you think about that, I mean, there's a very negative aspect about slavery, but when you think about someone literally carrying the children to the learning, that's pedagogy. So you might say, my goal today is for everyone to learn how to write a paragraph. Well, what are you going to do to get them there? That's the pedagogy. Are you going to show them examples? Are you going to create a paragraph together as a group? Are you going to tell them what each sentence should be trying to do? Are you going to draw a picture? What are you going to do? That's the pedagogy. And so curriculum and pedagogy can differ greatly from what students have come in with expecting, or it can be very closely aligned. And again, that doesn't mean that you need to change your pedagogy to connect with what students expect it to look like, but you do need to help build a bridge for them so that they understand, okay, this is the way that you've learned in the past, but in the U.S. or in this program or in this school, this is the way we tend to learn. And you can also try to build in some of those strategies, those methods that they've been using in their classes to this time. And finally, instruction. Instruction is what you breathe into it as the instructor. It's how well you're able to express to the students what they need to know, how willing you are to support it with lots of different ways of understanding, how willing you are to have questions asked, how willing you are to be kind of questioned in terms of what something means, how willing you are to give feedback, and how well you're able to do that and express that. That's all examples of instruction. And I think if all of us think back on our language teaching or rather our language learning that we've done, or even regular classroom experiences, we know that one instructor might teach very differently than another. One we connected with, one we didn't. That's examples of the big impact that instruction can make. So what you see on this organizer that you've been using to take notes, what you see is that there are very few things on here that we can actually impact. And in our discussion, maybe we'll talk through some of those, how you could, for example, reduce anxiety, how you could support language teaching, language learning strategies, how you could change your instruction so that you're more student-friendly. But for the most part, what we're looking at today is we're looking at what do your students come with and what's the context they're living in that really makes a difference in their language learning. So what I'd like you to do is to take a look at the notes that you took and to think about how this graphic organizer supported you today in taking those notes. What I'm hoping that you notice is that a graphic organizer can help with the big pieces. For example, it probably helped you to have two columns, or they're kind of like columns, to take notes on, to keep track of where we were in the lecture. Were we in the first half with internal or the second half with external? It probably also supported you in taking notes with the details. For example, when I said effective, because it was written down for effective language strategies, you didn't have to ask me or worry about, is it effective with an E, which means successful, or was it effective with an A, which means emotions and feelings. And so it can help in both of those ways. But I want you to think about that, and that too can come up in our discussion if you want online about how to support students with advanced organizers or graphic organizers. What do I want you to do next? I have a variety of readings for you to take a look at that look at things like personality, and they touch on some of these pieces. Social distance touches on some of these pieces, the language learning strategies. And then where I want you to go next is I'd like you to take a look at a reading that I put online. It's actually a series of pages from the Tapestry textbook series. And the Tapestry textbook series was created by Rebecca Oxford, and her thing is language learning strategies. And that series, unlike any other series I've ever seen, actually encourages students to use certain language learning strategies or suggests them or names them in the sidebar. So what I would like you to do, after you have read through the different pieces that I've got there, especially after you've read through the language learning strategy and information and you think about what you heard here, is I'd like you to take a look at those. They're in the sidebars, in the margins, and I'd like you to see if you can figure out which of the categories does this fit into. So for example, if in a sidebar it talks about mnemonic devices, so for example, remembering, if you have to remember something that one letter begins with T, one letter begins with H, and one letter begins with E, remembering that's an example of a mnemonic device. Which of these would it be? It'd be a memory, right? A memory language learning strategy. So just kind of do that thought experiment with yourself and see if you're able to name what those are. It will be really important for you in your toolkit to be really aware and remembering, find a way to remember these, and be able to recognize them so that you can name them for your students, so that you can introduce them in the right way for your students. Another thing that you will be doing is you will be watching 2 video interviews of very different language learners, and then meet us in the discussion, and I'd like you to make a unique kind of point in the discussion about one thing that you can take from the readings to connect with what you hear in the interview. So for example, if one of the language learners talks about their age and how they think their age has helped or hurt them, you could make a connection to the reading that mentions age as one of the factors. Or if you hear someone talking about how they really struggle with learning language because they really tend to they live in an apartment complex, everyone there speaks Arabic, they go to an Arabic grocery, they have dinner with all their friends who speak Arabic, and their teachers all speak Arabic as their second language, then you probably would connect with, for example, enclosure, one aspect of social distance, and you could make your comment about that. So watch those 2 videos and see what comes up for you. What do you notice? And of course, I welcome you to make more than one comment and to interact with others. If you disagree with someone, you think it's more this strategy or this aspect of social distance, go ahead and support that and comment on that, politely, of course, and respectfully. But I hope that you have enjoyed kind of hearing about what are the factors that professionals, just like you, just like me, think about when we look out at our language learners as we see them as individuals. Okay, enjoy the rest of the unit.